The ocean is big, in size as well as importance, and with the deep sea being the largest and most unexplored ecosystem on Earth, striving for a better understanding of deep sea ecosystems and the ways in which we are impacting them is vital. Thousands of meters beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, scientists from the ECOGIG Research Consortium are assessing the continued impacts of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the beautiful and ecologically important deep sea corals we call the jewels of the Gulf. Deep sea corals come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. In fact, scientists believe that more than 2/3 of the world's coral species live in the deep sea. Unlike their shallow water relatives that have plant cells living in their tissues and use photosynthesis to convert sunlight to energy, deep sea corals live in a world without sunlight and cannot directly rely on photosynthesis for food. Instead, deep sea corals use tentacles on their thousands of tiny polyps to capture prey like microscopic shrimps that float by in the deep sea currents, or take advantage of organic material falling from the surface.
Even though there's no light in the deep sea, the corals on the seafloor are often brightly colored. Bright oranges, purples, and reds. Really beautiful corals.
Deep sea corals are the foundation of ecosystems found on the Gulf of Mexico's sea floor. By increasing complexity and providing habitat, these deep sea corals transform a uniform, muddy sea floor into a hotspot where marine life like brittle stars, octopus, sharks, crabs, fish, and more thrive. On April 20th, 2010, approximately 50 miles from the Louisiana coastline, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig experienced a catastrophic failure that ultimately resulted in the largest marine oil spill in history. Over the course of 87 days, an estimated 210 million gallons of oil surged into the ocean from a wellhead nearly 1 mile beneath the surface. The consequences of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill were immense. Tragically, 11 men lost their lives in the explosion of the oil rig, and people whose livelihoods were economically dependent on the Gulf suffered greatly. The oil formed a slick extending over thousands of square miles of the Gulf of Mexico, killing thousands of birds, marine mammals, and sea turtles. And while impacts on the shorelines and at the surface were apparent, the oil spill actually occurred at depth, leaving scientists to wonder what impacts they would discover in the deep sea.
In 2010, after the spill, we were on a cruise out here, and part of that purpose was to see if we could find any deep sea communities that have been impacted by the spill. We didn't really know exactly what it was going to look like at that time, but when we came upon the first coral community 10 kilometers away from the wellhead that had been affected, it was obvious. Those corals were still covered by a brown material that was totally unnatural. Deep sea corals, usually most of the tissue's alive. When you see them, they're brightly colored. We came onto this community, everything was drab. More than half of the corals were partially covered by this brown flocculent material, something we'd never seen before anywhere else. At that point, we were actually documenting evidence of impact from the oil spill.
The observations made in the aftermath of the spill initiated a long-term research program focused on understanding the impacts of the spill on the deep sea Gulf of Mexico. In order to study these corals and their surrounding ecosystems, ECOGIG scientists use remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs. Specially trained ROV pilots control all movements of the unmanned submersible from a control room on board the ship.
When we deploy the ROV down to the deep sea, we have about an hour transit to get down there. And for the longest time, we don't see anything in the water column. It's pitch dark and we're sinking further and further down. And then suddenly we get to the bottom of the sea and there's life. There's so much life. With the lights that we take down with us, we're illuminating this world for the first time, because otherwise it just exists in pitch darkness.
Using cameras mounted on the ROV, the ECOGIG team takes high-resolution photos of individual coral colonies year after year to track impacts and recovery from the oil spill over time.
So the first stage is to find the corals. So for that, what we've been doing is we've been deploying a physical marker. So it's basically a weight with like a floating number and reflective tape, so that when you dive with the ROV, you can see it from far away. So you go to the marker, and around the marker there's gonna be several coral colonies. So we identify them, we position the ROV to take the photos. We're trying every year to take the photo using the same heading, because we want to take the exact same photo for each coral every single year. That way we can use the images to compare them and see how they change over time. So we would land, and then once we're in position, we will use the still camera that the arm of the ROV is holding, and we will take the photo of the corals.
Images of impacted deep-sea corals taken shortly after the spill show brightly colored corals partially covered with brown and black flocculent material. This material was not only made up of oil, but also the chemical dispersant that was applied in response to the spill. And even though the flocculent material broke down over time, impacts on the corals persisted. Now, nearly a decade since the spill, some impacted corals are showing signs of recovery with regrowth of brightly colored live tissue. Other impacted corals continue to show signs of degradation through branch loss and increased tissue loss. Colonization by other organisms such as hydroids also limit coral regrowth and recovery. Their ultimate fate is still unknown.
The fate of the individual corals there is still something we can't predict with any high level of confidence. Some of the corals have recovered quite well, but many others have not. They're continuing to lose branches, and in fact there's corals that are still alive now that we predict will completely die within the next couple of years.
There's also some long-term impacts that are even more difficult to actually measure. One example of this is how is coral reproduction affected? When an organism is stressed and needs to put a lot of resources into recovering from an injury, that energy then is not available to put towards reproduction. And so we're suspecting that even beyond the initial acute impact, there might still be longer-term, more subtle impact.
We're continuing to monitor the corals basically because things happen so slowly in the deep sea. These corals at the sites that were impacted, some of them are over 500 years old. So they grow slowly, they live slowly, and they die slowly. So we're still seeing effects year to year that are different if that coral was impacted in 2010 or not impacted in 2010.
The Gulf of Mexico deep sea ecosystem is unique in that animals living there have adapted to living near cold seeps, places on the sea floor where small amounts of chemicals like oil and methane naturally seep out into the ocean. ECOGIG scientists are investigating whether this adaptation affects the ability of corals to recover from disturbances like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
The deep Gulf of Mexico is really rich in oil and in methane, and that, of course, the reason why we have so many oil platforms out in the Gulf. The organisms that live in the deep Gulf get exposed to those chemicals naturally. So we're expecting these deep sea corals to be somewhat tolerant of oil and methane exposure, but these natural occurring seep events are quite different from what you would get during an oil spill. For one, there's the quantity. For example, Deepwater Horizon oil spill released, many orders of magnitude more oil over a short period of time than what you would ever get naturally.
Analyzing the environmental surroundings of these deep-sea corals is another integral part of assessing the impacts of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the deep-sea Gulf of Mexico. Using the ROV's robotic arm, sediment and water samples are collected at each dive site in order to compile a more complete picture of the health of these deep-sea ecosystems through time.
The coral in and of itself is important, but also the coral creates a habitat for a variety of different species, and the health of that environment is really an important part of the overall study. Examining the seafloor sediment communities really has helped us better understand how the oil spill has had an effect on the broader deep sea coral community at large. Since we've been monitoring the sediment communities since 2010, we've noticed that communities that are found there, the animals there, are continuing to change over time, and they haven't returned to what we would consider a healthy sediment community associated with deep sea coral habitat. So Basically, time will tell whether those communities will continue to change and return to what we expect would be a normal community, or if basically that change persists over time.
The effects of the 1.8 million gallons of chemical dispersant that were released into the Gulf of Mexico in response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is also something that ECOGIG scientists are studying with respect to these deep-sea corals.
So after the oil spill, dispersant was released. It was released on the surface of the ocean as well as it was injected at depth. And what it is it's a chemical that just breaks oil up into smaller pieces. And the idea is that the smaller the oil, the more quickly it will be broken down. In reality, it's a chemical that we're releasing into the ocean that wasn't there before. So it's affecting biology in a different way from the oil itself. So some of the samples we're collecting are actually live corals. So I will collect corals, bring them back to Temple University, then expose them to different treatments and run experiments on them. This allows us to see how the corals will actually respond in real time to any oil exposure or dispersant exposure, or the combination of oil and dispersants. Generally, when they're exposed to just oil alone, there's not much an effect on the coral's physiology or how the coral is responding. However, when we add dispersant into the water, so dispersant and oil together or dispersant just alone, the corals seem to be much more adversely affected.
Communicating with the public about deep-sea science and its relevance is an integral part of ECOGIG research in the Gulf. Outreach specialists work with the scientific team to create opportunities for the researchers to interact with the public. During the summer 2017 coral expedition, science team members shared their research and perspectives via live video interactions with students at universities and K-12 classrooms across the United States and internationally. Students and the public were also able to view a live ROV video feed and talk with scientists in real time.
We've had really great opportunities to interact with classrooms while we've been out here and have face-to-face conversations through Google Hangout. And it shows these younger children that this is a job that they can come out and do. I know when I was younger, it was interactions like this that really prompted me to go into marine science.
As a scientist, I'm incredibly privileged to be curious and discover new things. It is, I think, really motivational for kids, for anybody really, to see how much we yet need to learn about the planet we live on. The deep sea is really a great place where we can share the excitement of science with a new generation of scientists.
While the scientific goals and objectives of ECOGIG are numerous and multifaceted, at the core of this research is deep sea exploration. With more than 95% of the deep sea still left to be explored, every ROV dive is an exciting and groundbreaking adventure into the unknown depths of our planet.
We're still learning so much about the deep sea that every time I go out on an expedition, we see something different, something I haven't seen before. The fact is, we're still really learning a lot about the mysterious deep.
For me, studying the deep sea is a really exciting opportunity to go to places that very few people get to see or visit. The deep sea is the largest environment in our planet. More than 99% of all the volume that can be used by living organisms in the planet is actually found in the deep sea. So studying the deep sea for me is really studying our planet and the life that has evolved and what the implications it has to our lives.
So every time we go out on an expedition like this ECOGIG cruise that we're on right now, we're filming the deep sea. And chances are we're filming a piece of it or a behavior or an animal that hasn't been studied either in detail or just at all. So because there's so much unknown about the deep sea, it means that everything we do is new and pretty exciting to us.
While these deep-sea ecosystems are out of sight and out of mind for most, through this research, ECOGIG scientists are bringing the deep sea and our connection to it into people's thoughts and hopefully into people's hearts. Years after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, these deep-sea corals and their surrounding communities are still recovering, and their ultimate fate is unknown. While much remains to be learned about how deep-sea corals respond to human-caused disturbances, there is no doubt that a more complete understanding will advance our knowledge of deep-sea ecosystems and hopefully guide management decisions in response to future oil spills and other human-caused disturbances.
So one of the things that we learned over the course of studying these corals that were affected by the spill is that they're really a perfect sentinel for anthropogenic impact in the deep sea. They're like the canary in the coal mine for the deep sea. We can look for climate change, we can look for oil spills, we can look for fishing impact, and corals are the organism that we can use to do that. But I think the most important is that we're studying the ecology. We're learning more about how they're connected to the rest of the world's oceans. We're also learning how they're being impacted by the activities of man and how long it takes them to recover from that.
The deep sea might seem like this whole other world when you think about it in perspective to yourself, but it's actually something that we're connected to in so many ways, just as we are the ocean in general. When these ecosystems are functioning all together, they're producing a healthier ocean, which is essentially producing a healthier world.
The ocean contains 99% of the living biosphere of our planet. Threats to its health both in the shallows as well as in the deep sea create repercussions that affect all life on Earth. ECOGIG's deep sea research plays a vital role in developing a better understanding of these unique ecosystems, as well as the ways in which we as humans are impacting them. And with deep sea corals being the jewels of the Gulf, scientists look to them for the answers.